Good afternoon and welcome to episode 3 of Dimitri Live. My name is Atul Bahl and I'm a retired educator in Ontario, currently working in an advisory role in the Dimitri Lascaris campaign for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. These weekly episodes are created to provide a space for dialogue about the complex issues that we are facing in this global COVID-19 pandemic. This week, we examine how deeply entrenched structural inequities in society, particularly along race lines, are being exacerbated during the pandemic. So let's start and let's get rolling. I'd like to bring in lawyer, journalist, and activist Dimitri Lascaris. Hey, Dimitri, how are you?
I'm great, Atul. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay.
You know, before I begin, I want to just express on behalf of our entire campaign team our incredible sadness at what has happened in Nova Scotia. Even in normal times, that would be an unspeakable burden for the people of Nova Scotia to have to bear. But with all that's going on, I mean, it's truly an unspeakable tragedy. So our hearts and thoughts go to the friends and family of the victims of this mass shooting.
Indeed, adds another solemn note to what we're already going through and struggling with. On that, let me transition, if I can, to this week's episode and our discussion. Let me begin by saying, Dimitri, I've known you for 20 years at least now. We're close friends. We share a family connection, and those who know us well or have come to know us oftentimes refer to us as brothers from different mothers. Yeah. I don't recall, certainly in the last decade, that you and I have gone a month without actually meeting face to face, breaking bread, and enjoying some quality time together. It's one of the things that I've kind of missed the most during this lockdown. And it reminds us of the threads that bind our lives together and how we sometimes we take those for granted. But my goodness, have I ever missed our outings?
Yeah, and some would say we actually, in some ways, come from the same mother spiritually, because our mothers are two incredible women who have this amazing ability to celebrate life, no matter what the circumstances, no matter what the hardships. And I'd like to think that you and I learned something from them in that regard, and we bring that into every moment that we spend together. It's been really hard, Atul, not to be able to share those moments with you in this difficult period. And of course, you and I have other people who are close to us, and we've had to go without all of those relationships during this period, at least the in-person relationships. And it's been a lesson for me in how important, my friendship with you is, and with all these other people who have been absent from my life during this crisis. I'm sure every Canadian, every person in this world who's going through this lockdown is feeling something very similar. And I hope that we'll all emerge from this, and we will. And I think in the not too distant future, and that we'll all emerge from this with a greater appreciation of how much our fellow human beings mean to us. I certainly am coming out. I've already learned that lesson in this crisis.
I think that's increasingly something that people are being awakened to as they go through a fairly prolonged period of isolation. I want to move to getting some of your thoughts on the last month or so. I think we've now been in sort of an emergency setting. I believe it was about mid-March when emergency states were kind of put into effect around the country. I want to get a sense from you, what stands out for you in terms of the impact of this experience on a collective level?
Well, the thing that by far I think stands out for me at a collective level is what we can accomplish when there's the political will to accomplish it. We have been told for decades in countries throughout the West and across the world about the limited means at our disposal and how that forces us to take an incremental approach, and in some cases, no approach whatsoever that's even remotely effective to dealing with the urgent necessities that we must deal with as a species, as a country, And I'm thinking, of course, about the climate crisis, but I'm also thinking about homelessness, about poverty. Suddenly, when our government and other governments around the world who have been repeating this mantra, that we have to live within our means, implying that our means don't allow us to do what's necessary to eliminate homelessness, poverty, to deal with the climate emergency. Suddenly, they've summoned up stunning amounts of money in order to address a near-term threat. And yet, when you look at the climate crisis and the potential that it has to render the entire planet unlivable, the only conclusion you could rationally come to is that it is an even greater threat by a considerable margin than the one we currently confront. And yet, virtually nothing has been done in that regard. We have a country here, a government which adopted, the very weak emission reduction targets of the Trudeau government when it came to power. It had criticized those targets when it was in opposition. It isn't even on a pace to meet those pathetically weak targets. And it's been, telling us all along that we have to make this transition in a way that's incremental without even making any real transition at all, to be frank about it. I think we should come out of this crisis understanding that all that has ever been lacking is the political will. That's it. The means have always been at our disposal. And if that is something that emerges from this crisis, then even with all the suffering and the tragedy that it has entailed, perhaps it will have been worth it. We can do everything that we have been calling to be done. It's simply a matter of political will.
And the means you talk about, the resources that are being distributed are those of the collective. They belong to the collective. They are not something that is outside of the collective realm. It is really ultimately about how they're being distributed. And as you point out, there is the ability to redistribute our collective wealth in ways which not only benefit some, but ultimately benefit the larger collective itself. A second question, Dimitri, that I want to sort of get you to think about is, what are some of the progressive possibilities you see coming out of this moment in history? What do you hope for?
Well, I think in the near term, certainly, I hope that this focuses people's minds on how well equipped we are to deal with the climate emergency. But I think in the nearer term, because of these emergency programs that we've seen being adopted, for example, the CERB and the various forms of income support that have suddenly materialized for people who have either lost their jobs or who have suffered a substantial reduction in income. I think what it's showing us is that a universal basic income is entirely possible, and that it is something that sort of our basic sense of human decency really requires us to do. It obliges us to do. There's absolutely no reason why in a country as wealthy as Canada, anybody should ever fall through the cracks. And that's just not true in an emergency such as this. That's also true in normal times. Why should even tens of thousands of Canadians be living in the streets, which is the normal situation? Why should millions of Canadians be living in poverty, which is what we call normality in this country? We have the ability to actually provide to every single member of our society the means to achieve his or her potential and to live a decent and dignified life. And I'm seeing all over the place a sense that the universal basic income is something that's eminently achievable, and that it's something that's absolutely indispensable. And I'd very much like to see that become a permanent feature of the socioeconomic landscape in this country. And we should fight tooth and nail when this crisis is over to ensure that we build upon the CERB, not that we eliminate it and bring it to an end as a temporary measure. This should be something permanent and should be expanded.
I think it's important to note that in pandemics, I guess historically, or following pandemics, there's no inevitability about what direction society will take. We can hope for certain things, and we see certain aspects of society changing in our midst during the pandemic itself, but it will take organizing, and it will take movement building to move in the direction that you're talking about, not only with respect to income, but also with respect to climate itself. And so I think it's really important that we remember that there are opportunities, but they will need to be mobilized. We're already starting to see the right getting mobilized, and that's concerning in terms of the way in which they would like to ultimately shift the narrative as we come out of this pandemic.
Well, it's interesting, I think that the progressive movement has learned a great deal in the last 10 years. If you look back at the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, what movement did that spawn immediately? It spawned something that came to be known as the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was quite ephemeral. It only really lasted a few months, maybe even a few weeks at its height. And then it seemed to evaporate, but in fact, it never evaporated. All of that passion within the progressive movement for real change and for seizing political power and effectuating change never went away. It just morphed into other movements. And one of the movements that it had morphed into was the movement that Bernie Sanders helped to build in the United States, and the movement that Jeremy Corbyn helped to build in the United Kingdom. And although they didn't ultimately achieve power, they came quite close, and they've now helped to put progressive politicians in positions of significant responsibility, both in the United States and the United Kingdom. And now it's up to us to build upon what they built. We're building, it's like a scaffolding, and we're building a structure. It started, you know, in the financial crisis in a very sort of haphazard, disorganized way, but it's becoming much more disorganized, or organized, I should say, much more effective, much more thoughtful. And it is up to us, the current generation of leaders and and candidates and people who aspire to hold political office, to take that to the next level.
And that's why we're thrilled that you've actually put your hat into this leadership race. And what you bring to it is unique and powerful and important, particularly during these times.
Thank you.
I think from my standpoint, one of the things that concerns me the most, at this stage, is the mental health impacts that this is having on everyone. I've spoken to people around the world, family and friends, and one thing comes out consistently, and that is this is taking a toll. And it is rewiring our daily lives in many ways. It's putting on hold the things that we kind of take for granted or cherish, as we talked about earlier. But I also feel strongly that those of us who enjoy a degree of privilege are insulated from some of the more pernicious aspects of this pandemic. Mm-hmm. I worry that we lose sight of that as we're enveloped in our own struggles and our own sense of loss, particularly when we look at the underprivileged among us and around the world, those whose daily lives are characterized by oppression, by marginality, by poverty. Their life experience is not on hold during this pandemic. It is actually intensified. And there's no more place that this is evident than in the United States at this time. The statistics coming out, the race-based COVID-19 statistics that are coming out of the United States are tragic. And they speak to a reality that communities of color, and in particular, African Americans, are disproportionately suffering and dying as a result of this pandemic. I'd like to dive into that a little bit more deeply, and I want to bring in our guest to help us unpack some of these issues. Kike Ojo-Thompson is the founder and principal consultant of Kojo Institute. An award-winning expert on equity, inclusion, and diversity, Kike specializes in developing, facilitating, and implementing innovative solutions for creating equity at an institutional level. Welcome, Kike.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Can you begin by trying to shed a little bit of light on the alarming figures that are coming out of the US at this time?
Sure. I mean, I think it's the same issues or the same roots that cause Black people to show up in a number of different statistics in terms of overrepresentation. So when I think about Black women, I think about the overrepresentation of Black women dying in childbirth. I think of, sort of the overrepresentation of folks with diabetes and asthma and sort of those sorts of things. So it's actually not a different issue. It is about health inequity. Ultimately, it's about how racism is actually a determinant of health. And so as long as there is racism, that will actually determine the extent to which people experience ultimate health outcomes.
Kike, first of all, let me say I'm thrilled to have you on the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. I've become an admirer of your work, and I feel I'm privileged to have you on the program. Thank you. You talked about. I'd like to give us more insight into how the disadvantages confronting Black Canadians have played out in this country. So, if you could talk to us about the levels of poverty that you see prevailing in Black communities, incarceration rates, health-related measures of well-being. What is the big picture in Canada now for Black citizens?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad you mentioned poverty. I want to start by talking about poverty. I think there is a powerful unexamined idea that Black people are poor, that, sort of all Black people are poor. And I really want to kind of disrupt that idea, and at the same time acknowledge that we are disproportionately found in poverty statistics. So, which is not the same thing as saying all Black people are poor, right? So when we look at poverty statistics and we were to disaggregate those for race, we would find that yes, there's an overrepresentation of Black people there. And I think, poverty can be said to be sort of a consequence of social exclusion that comes with racism, that comes with systemic racism. Unemployment, underemployment, isolation, not sort of being well connected as an individual, as a family, as a community. Those things sort of will sort of add to or create outcomes of that kind of social exclusion.
Against that backdrop, one would think that a good thing for the government to do would be to compile data on how marginalized communities, including the Black community or persons within the Black community who are particularly vulnerable, are being affected by COVID-19 in particular in this moment of crisis that we're dealing with, this pandemic. What do you have to say about the job that the Canadian government and provincial governments are doing about compiling the data necessary to understand how this crisis is affecting marginalized groups in this country?
I mean, it's completely disappointing. And more than that, I think we have to start to say very clearly that insofar as the government refuses to mandate insofar as the government refuses to present data, collect the data in a disaggregated way, and then present it back, or require all of our institutions to do that, it is participating in the creation of racist outcomes, or it is a racist way to be. It is a racist approach to the management of our country and the management of our province. I didn't speak to your point about incarceration, Dimitri, and I don't want to miss that. There is no question that our community faces hyper surveillance, hyper targeting. In the context of justice, we see sort of sort of a harsh use of discretion at the hands of the judges, court system. So two people could do the very same thing, and how the Black person is punished for it and held to account is sort of far more far more harsh than others, and we see that across the country. So the incarceration piece is really concerning, but I really want to flag for listeners that if you dig a little deeper, it is not the levels of incarceration, the proportion of Black people who are incarcerated in our systems is not a direct relationship to the committing of crimes sort of different or more than other communities, but that systemic racism in our criminal justice system is very real, and so we see things like carding, for example, which is an issue that is dear to my heart, that I've worked on personally, where for no good reason people are stopped and sort of their information and data taken, and then from there on you're known to police. So, for example, the next time you're stopped or the next time you're walking down the street, that gets sort of seen as that counts against you having been carded. And so these are the sorts of ways that systemic racism is sort of playing out in significant ways.
Yeah, in fact, one thing I've tried to be vocal about in the last couple of weeks is how people within the correctional system people are being detained in Canada's correctional system are extremely vulnerable at this moment. And I've heard from people who actually work in the correctional system and want it to be a more humane system say that the authorities, the management of various correctional facilities in this country have done just a terrible job of protecting not only persons who are incarcerated, but also correctional staff. And of course, if a community is overrepresented in the correctional system, then they are going to be impacted even more so than the general population by the COVID-19 crisis. And I'm curious to know, Kike, in what other ways have you seen, do you think, like specific examples that might come to mind about how the COVID-19 crisis has exposed anti-Black racism in this country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so.
Sorry to interrupt, Kike. Just before you answer that, I just want to remind viewers that they can ask questions on YouTube chat. A lot of the discussion that's happening, I'm sure, is going to stimulate questions. So please feel free to submit your questions when you see fit. Sorry, continue, Kike.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think, so, the increased, one of the features of anti-Black racism, really its core feature is state authority and how state authority is used in relation to Black communities. And so when we look at sort of the expansion of police powers that is really being called upon right now to really manage a public health crisis. So increased police powers to ticket, to detain if necessary, to sort of control the community, et cetera. That's really worrisome because we've never dealt with the sort of original issues that are facing the Black community with regards to policing, for example, and with regards to the community, criminal justice system. So what does this look like? I'm really concerned about how long this will go on in terms of expanded police powers, because there hasn't been sort of a pumping of the brakes on sort of how that plays out on a regular day, much less in the context of COVID. So there's definitely that. And of course, we're seeing sort of the differential treatment is so glaring and so blatant. Groups getting together. We saw in Vancouver a group getting together to protest, social distancing and protest sort of a lockdown or quarantine. And they were in the middle of the day on a bright Vancouver corner, like, a major Vancouver intersection in the middle of the day, gathered, not 6 feet apart, not, maintaining any of those rules, and yet not one police officer in sight, no sort of, sort of policing, military, nothing. And, so many of us in the Black community are like, we could never do that. And particularly not in the name of protesting the quarantine. So, these are really blatant things. And it's so interesting. I ended up in a bit of a Twitter chat, which, I'll learn my lesson eventually, with someone just who was kind of clueless as to why that would be upsetting or what message that was really sending. And I, had to sort of spell out, white people in this country are the only people who could get away with protesting this public health, requirement that says stay home and keep space from each other. And that's a really clear sign of how this is playing out. And the other thing I would say is that the exposure of essential workers. So when we look at who is this employment group, who is this group of people that we call essential, whether it be grocery store workers or TTC drivers. So in the context of the city of Toronto, that's our massive transit system. Or it be nursing on many levels. So people that are working in our long-term care facilities, people who are cleaning our hospitals, etc. And I could go on. Those people tend to be Black and racialized people, new immigrants, and the people with the least resources that cannot exercise choice to stay home. And so we're definitely seeing it in terms of them and this whole question about how PPE, whether they're given the opportunity to be as safe as possible. So just, sort of a scattered set of examples to really kind of think about.
And evidence has emerged, you mentioned TTC staff, evidence is emerging that transit workers are being disproportionately infected with the coronavirus. So, I mean, again, another way in which racialized groups are being disproportionately affected by this crisis. And I want to just touch on something you mentioned, the whole disgraceful phenomenon of carding you've dealt with at length. On March 31st, the Ontario government passed an order under the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act that gives police in all provincial offenses officers the power to require anyone they think is breaking emergency laws to show them identification. Given the historical experience of Black Canadians with carding, how do you expect that that power is going to be used? Would you expect it's going to be used equitably without the influence of racist sentiments, or do you think that there's something that's going to come, is going to be used disproportionately against communities of color?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that you know, sort of policing practices around, you know, where they're policing and sort of where the surveillance is happening is going to really change. So, you know, and so the same communities that typically experience interactions, or, you know, are made to sort of interact with the police should just expect sort of more of the same. And, you know, again, these are communities that cannot afford, you know, to have yet another ticket, another, sorry, I forgot the word, citation, you know, another thing that they got to go and take care of in some kind of way, pay it, go to the court, do the thing, when they've got jobs, when they've got families, like, you know, so there's just, again, it's the meshing of the public health crisis with, you know, using expanded police powers as the answer. It begs a number of questions. And we've seen it over history, sort of how, you know, expanded police powers kind of get connected to public health. And I don't know that it works. So this is going to be the interesting piece, right? People are exposing themselves. Many people are exposing themselves not because they want to, but because their life circumstance does not enable distancing, does not, you know, if they go home, it's not distancing, you know, like there's all kinds of contexts that need to be considered.
Social distancing actually is a luxury for many.
That's right.
A number of us find it a bit of a nuisance, but it is something that people cannot afford to do at all in various walks of life.
Mm-hmm. I know some people who kind of went to the cottage, you know, as soon as they kind of figured out there was going to be this sort of, you know, sort of lockdown requirement, et cetera. They took off to the cottage, and I put the cottage in quotes because, you know, you think north, it could be east, it doesn't matter, but they have this space where they can then be out and be, you know, have a lot of land and be in privacy, and there's no police surveillance and all of this sort of thing. So depending on what your body looks like. And so, you know, and sort of running off to do that. And yet, you know, people that are here and cannot leave are expected to just maintain this. So we need to, I'm hoping that there's a conversation soon about what is sustainable, because we're in this for a longer period than I think most would be comfortable with. And we've got to figure out how can people kind of do this in ways that are realistic. So that's another topic.
So I'd like to move outside of the context of COVID-19, Kike, and talk to you about something that's of particular concern to members of the Green Party. We have 6 core values. One of those core values is respect for diversity, and I know that that is something that you know, every member of the Green Party feels very deeply about. But at the same time, there was a disturbing development in the election last year where the National Observer did a survey and sought to ascertain how many candidates, what proportion of candidates from the various parties, you know, were from communities of color. And unfortunately, it turned out that the Green Party of Canada in that regard was underperforming by a significant margin. And in fact, according to the survey, it had even less candidates from racialized groups than the People's Party of Canada. And I know that this has become a very important theme, and rightly so, in this leadership campaign. And I'm really curious to know from you, and I know this is a big question, it's a complex question. I imagine you can only touch on it very briefly within the confines of this, this program, but what do you think that a political party like the Green Party of Canada can do to begin to make candidates from racialized groups more comfortable running for our party? Because that's something that we all really want to see happen.
Yeah, I think, and this is going to sound strange, and I'll try to explain it. I think that the party needs to redefine green. So, you know, obviously, you know, the Green Party is about something obvious, and at the center of the issues for the Green Party is the environment. And I think that people need to feel like the issues that they consider to be life and death, like their issues of survival now, today, this week, next week, are also taken care of. And I really think that there's sort of a reputation then of, you know, this piece around climate only. And I think as soon as the party can figure out how to break out of the idea of climate only, so that's one. I think that the green space, the environmental space, the climate change space has constructed itself in a way that really suggests that the people that matter are really white folks. And it's a particular type of white folk too, right? So this idea that the people that are doing this environmental work are white folks, you know, and so it's a narrative that really leaves people of color, racialized people, and definitely Black people out, because it's sort of taking up environmentalism in a particular way. And what you don't see, so you know, you and I were chatting sort of before, and we talked about the fact that I lived in Atlanta. I lived in Atlanta for almost 3 years, and I was leading the creation of an environmental justice strategy for the city of Atlanta. And there, it was about the justice work, right? The work around the environment was about environmental justice. So who's being exposed to what? Is that equitable? You know, even when you talk about natural resources, et cetera, the use and the pull on those sorts of things. And there's not a conversation, you know, here in Canada as much, and in the GTA and Canada at large, around the issues regarding environment. So, I mean, even to center Indigenous people and sort of the use of the land and sort of what land they've been relegated to and those sorts of things, that's not been sort of how the Green Party has sort of shown up. And I think the Green Party needs to lead the uptake of this conversation in terms of making it a conversation about justice. And the last thing, well, I won't say the last thing I'll say, but the other thing I want to say is that, you know, the Green Party has to show up in relation to the issues that are impacting people. So if we want to be relevant, if the Green Party wants to be relevant to a more diverse group of people, then they need to show up about the issues that impact a diverse group of people. So we need to hear the Green Party's place and position, excuse me, around the critical issues of our time, around, you know, and I mean, not just have the policy in, you know, documents, but when something is going on in our country, we need the Green Party to stand up and out to say where they stand. So on carding in Ontario would have been really good for, you know, major state, not just sort of when asked and not reactively, but to be proactive around issues to do with justice. And, you know, we talk about carding, we talk about it in this all-encompassing way, but, you know, even things like police officers in schools, that is a major issue in communities where there's remotely significant Black numbers, Black population in this country. And, you know, I remember when I was a high school teacher many moons ago, and having to say to some of the police officers in the school that I taught at, you know, and it was a long time ago, so I think many times they presumed I was a student, although I was wearing my sort of tag and, you know, evidence, whatever. And I had to say, I'm a teacher here. I need you to stop looking at me like that. Like, I had to disrupt the gaze of these police officers in the school as a Black person in the building. And so that's just an example of many, many, many things. But we need sort of unprovoked for the Green Party to stand up and step out. And I can be very concerned about the environment once you've taken care of my existence, my safe existence, my right to be in school and not be harmed, to, you know, to be in my community and feel a part of it. Those are sort of the day-to-day things that we also have to be talking about in order to engage. I'll put it to you like this. I'll never forget, there was a number of years ago, I want to say it was the YMCA. It was a YMCA related program. I'm still trying to remember, but it was a program that I was asked to kind of weigh in on, that was going to engage youth to, this is a Toronto-centric example, but engage youth to pick up garbage along the Don Valley. So like to clean up the Don Valley one night, which is one of our major highways in the Toronto area. So to do this cleanup, and there became this narrative about like, why were there so few Black kids that were involved in this, and don't they care about the environment, and all this kind of thing. And one of my elder mentors said so rightly, we're still debating as to whether to give those youth their citizenship, their belonging, and their birthright in this country. And you want them to, without having addressed that, go and pick up garbage on the Don Valley that you haven't even allowed for them to own as theirs, right? Until we clean up and clear up our issues of, who gets to be a Canadian, who gets to own their birthright in this country. And until we do that, please understand that issues of climate and green and anything else are going to be secondary. So the Green Party will have an army of people lined up once they get behind those sorts of issues. At least that's true for, I will humbly speak for the Black community to say that those issues first, not because we don't understand that if we don't have if we don't have climate justice and we don't address climate crisis, that we're all going to perish. We understand that, but the party needs to stand with and beside as well. So. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those insights. If I could summarize, I don't want to oversimplify, but we need to actually listen to the concerns of racialized groups. What is affecting their lives? What are the challenges that are peculiar to their communities? And the more we listen and the more we respond to those challenges and concerns, the more I think will be attractive to them. And I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely essential.
Dimitri, if I may, sorry to interrupt you. So listen, I just feel like the word listen was underscored. And I want to humbly and with respect, underscore the word, the act piece, right? We want, if the actions are not matching what has been heard, communities are fed up of telling anybody what's going on for them. They've told us there are tens of reports in every sector: criminal justice, child welfare, health, mental health, education. There is so much evidence about what needs to be done. I believe what the community will want to see is that the party is actively taking up the issues based on what has been said over and over and over again. We need to go from being allies to accomplices, and from detractors, right? Just, in response, to disruptors, going ahead with intention. That's what the community is looking for.
I think, Kike, what you're talking about is a substantive change in the way that we do politics. It's really ultimately hitting at the core of how we dialogue with one another, how we respect one another, and how we treat one another as citizens in this country.
That's right.
I have one question an audience member is posing, which in some ways is kind of tying back to where we started the conversation with you. And that is, what can we learn in Canada from the US experience, particularly during the COVID-19 crisis?
Mm-hmm. Oh, goodness. Well, that if we leave people behind, so to speak, so if we, the US does a fairly aggressive job of collecting the data in disaggregated ways and reporting that data. So it is not difficult to find disaggregated data in the US in any sector, in about any issue. But they've so they see their really problematic outcomes, and they've kind of lived with it. They live in what I kind of feel like is like a hyper capitalism. So, survive if you can, may the best man win, and, survival of the fittest, and, all this kind of thing. And it's just proof and evidence, that people will die en masse, first of all, as a result of that. And I think more importantly, that the brunt of the implication or the impact of that, the consequences of that will fall on everyone. So while, yes, I think in Michigan, 40% of the deaths are the African American community, and only 13% of the state is African American. And these sorts of things. But the stress and strain on the system is far more expensive than doing what it takes to shore people up, to ensure that people are, have, basic things that they need. universal health care, we should not privatize, do not go in the direction of privatization. That is what they're in and that's what they're doing. It means that people will not go to the doctor to address and manage the simplest of things that begin simply, that again can spiral out of control. You add something like COVID and they cannot be saved. And so, so we see, we can't leave the worst off people behind. We have to continue to keep our social safety net strong. We have to invest in things like, basic income, a basic income strategy that is federal, and keep our systems strong. And, one of the things that people are forgetting is that not just before, but before COVID, that the conservative government in this country had taken a lot of money out of healthcare. They've taken money and resources out of healthcare, and then this kind of thing happens. And the proof is, we've proven that we need as much resources in all of our social safety net, all of our social systems, in order to survive something like this, that if it should ever happen again. So if we can learn anything from the US, is what happens when you over privatize. So,
and Kike, if I may, sorry, Dimitri, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to highlight one thing. I think all of what you said is so important, Kike, but you talked about the costs to the healthcare system of, if I could summarize, poverty. We're having a debate in this party, and it's one that you hear oftentimes amongst parties that lean in a progressive direction about fiscal responsibility. What is fiscal responsibility? And I think it's really important for people to understand that not only are the costs of poverty and racism devastating to those who are actually targeted by them or suffering from them, but there are also vast societal costs to these things. There are costs to the healthcare system. There's costs in terms of mental health. There's costs in terms of policing, and there's costs in terms of crime. And if we were actually to invest the public resources necessary to eliminate homelessness and poverty, we would save a lot of money. So of course, what we should be primarily concerned about is the human impact. But even if you're just confining yourself entirely to the economic and fiscal consequences of this investment, it still is the right thing to do. It's absolutely the right long-term strategy. And that is actually the fiscally conservative approach.
Yeah, part of the reason that parties become illogical in this way, so to your point, they're concerned about fiscal responsibility, and in the face of the evidence, will still choose, the alternative, is because of this country's commitment to ideas of meritocracy. That people should only get what they worked for. If you have something, it's because you work for it. If you don't have it, it means you didn't work for it. I mean, there are so many examples that disprove that. So, but it's so rooted. It's rarely spoken of. And so we end up making decisions like the ones you're talking about that don't make sense, frankly, that are actually not fiscally responsible. And the other thing about our financial story as a country is that we make big decisions about how to divide our money, and then we have a pot for social services, and then we dice that pot for social services into the smallest of slivers. And frankly, we need to be having a debate about things like military spending and corporate spending and all of those things. That has to be a part of the conversation if we're going to talk about budgets and fiscal accountability, et cetera. So
100%.
And lastly, I'll just add that this country also, in many respects, has a discourse of multiculturalism and diversity that often hides the historical and contemporary structural inequities and racism that exists. And I think we have to get past that. At least in the United States, people are talking about these issues. There are movements that have ultimately kept the issue of racism and exclusion and poverty in the public light. In the last few days, we've seen article after article talking about how painful it is to see the loss of a generation of Black people in the United States. We too often in this country hide to some extent behind this discourse of multiculturalism and diversity and don't look at our own backyard in a critical enough fashion. And I think it's really important that that also needs to constantly be brought into the political discussion.
100%. I mean, I think it's sometimes a curse that we're right beside the US because we are constantly in this comparison mode. And I can't tell you how many people I talk to every day that are just like, well, we're not the US, and they sort of absolve themselves. But here's the thing: one of the problems I see is that we have been talking about diversity and inclusion and multiculturalism and all of these things, but what hasn't been centered is dominance. So, people talk about it like we're all just different, and we're the same in the fact that we're all different from each other, right? Well, we're not the same. So I'm different from you, Dimitri, for example, and there's power relations playing out here. And as a Black woman, I do not have as much power as you do as a white man, as a white appearing man, right, Dimitri? So, so that is what's ignored oftentimes in the conversations around so-called multiculturalism, so-called diversity and inclusion. We are not talking about power relations and where dominance lies as set up by legacies of slavery and colonialism and patriarchy and capitalism, etc. That's out of the conversation. So we talk about difference, but we don't talk about who has power in those differences.
Right, absolutely. So multiculturalism assumes many times like a horizontal structure to our society, but it's vertical, it's hierarchical. And that gets lost in the whole discussion about multiculturalism. Absolutely. So, Atul.
Yeah, Kike, I'm going to just wrap up by, first of all, again, thanking you for your contributions. You have incredibly keen lens on these issues and very powerful insights. You've left us with a lot to think about and act on, as you mentioned. So thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kike.
Thank you.
Great to have you. Bye-bye. Take care. Be safe.
Bye.
Safe and healthy. Bye-bye.
So Dimitri, that was pretty powerful. Did anything stand out for you? Well, I'm sure a lot, but what stood out for you most?
There's so much. The one thing that just still resonating in my mind is this emphasis on action.
Yeah.
I think in the last 10 years, a lot of politicians in the West have perfected this art of speaking the language of empathy, pretending to listen, and maybe to some extent they actually are hearing what is being said, but getting away without actually taking any concrete action to implement the concerns of their constituents, particularly the most vulnerable. So for example, sometimes you'll hear the government, Justin Trudeau, talk about poverty. Once in a while he'll mention the word, but where is the action? Where is the action to deal with the scourge of homelessness? There's sympathy being expressed at the political level for these things. Time is taken from, occasionally to listen to activists in this space about what is actually happening to people on the ground, but there's never any follow through. And I think that is a point that every single person running in this race and every other political race in this country needs to take home and think about very carefully. We need to act. The time has come to go beyond listening. And I'm so happy that Kike stressed that point. I think it can't be stressed enough.
I think the other thing that struck me was when she talked about redefining green, particularly as it applies to or is experienced by communities of color and Black Canadians. And I think it's something for us to look at. And we have been, as a campaign, talking about how do we get beyond the perception that the Green Party is a single issue party. The environment is not a single issue. It's a multi-pronged, complex issue. But we need to do a better job at communicating that and showing the interconnections between the environment, between human rights, between poverty, between economic distribution, between resources. There needs to be a much better job at making green more relevant to more people. What were your thoughts on what she had said around that?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, she's preaching to the converted. I've been saying this at every opportunity I've had to speak to members of this wonderful party that, we are perceived as being a one-issue party. We actually have 6 values. 2 of those values, or 3 that are really important and equally important to ecological sustainability and ecological wisdom, are social justice, peace, and respect for diversity. And although we have in the past, for example, universal basic income, this has been a plank in the Green Party platform for some time. Although we do have policies that are oriented towards social justice, peace, and respect for diversity, we need to do much more in that regard. We need to be bolder. So for example, Kike talked about carding. That's an issue that we should be talking about. We should be talking about the violation of the civil rights of persons in racialized groups. We should be talking about that a lot. And we should be putting that right up there with the environment, as well as peace, as well as demilitarization. We have 6 core values in this party, not 2. And each one of them is equally important. And I think we have a twofold challenge. The one is to communicate better that we do actually take all 6 of those values seriously, but we need to also expand our platform and adopt policies that are actually going to improve the lives of the least advantaged members of our society.
And before we wrap up, we have one more audience question for you, Dimitri. Yuri asks, does Dimitri believe that mental health care should be part of our single-payer healthcare system?
Without question, absolutely. Why would anybody draw a distinction between those two? A human being is not, a compartment. Mental health, physical health, these things are intimately intertwined, and drawing a distinction between them, I think, makes no sense. I think, we had Gabor Mate on our last program, Atul, and he was talking about the fact that we really don't even have a mental health strategy in this country, not just one that deals with the crisis at hand, but more broadly, even in what we call normal times, we don't have an effective national health, mental health care strategy. We have a complete, as Gabor Mate, Dr. Mate was saying, we have a complete misconception of what addiction is all about. We haven't even begun to grapple with that as a society. What does addiction actually mean? And so, if we want to truly have a healthy, sustainable country and society, we need to put just as many eggs into the mental health basket as we're putting into what we conventionally think of as healthcare.
And I think that the mental health aspects of COVID-19 are going to be felt for quite some time. I don't even believe at this stage we have seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of how people are ultimately dealing with this and the intersection between one's mental health and one's physical well-being. And so it absolutely needs to be part of our entire healthcare system and supported. So on that note, folks, I think we're going to wrap up this episode. Check out what Dimitri is doing on Facebook, on Twitter, and on his campaign website at teamdimitri.ca. And please join us next week when we will be exploring the intersection between COVID-19 and domestic violence, another very difficult and challenging issue that we're facing at this time. Everyone, please be well and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take
Bye-bye.
care.